Imagine a education minister popping up with you and say, "Tell me the 5 magic sentences which will change the country's fate, which I am in." What would you tell? What would you tell them?
Yeah, I think firstly, number one, I would encourage the ministers of education firstly to provide access to their citizens, to those young students, access to new technologies. So that would be smartphone technology, internet, and it's not expensive, but a focus firstly to provide access. Secondly, to ensure the students are using their technology. So there's an education process. In some cultures and countries there's a fear of new technology, so it's really both providing the access to the technology, and secondly is ensuring people are educated to use that technology. Thirdly is to create ease to use the technology. Often, particularly with developing a new business and social entrepreneurialism, people can be weighed down with bureaucracy, red tape, even corruption. But we're really wanting to, like a river, let the waters flow. So we need to ensure that economies allow opportunity for this young talent to do their thing and not be strangled by bureaucracy. The fourth thing I would say is recognise people who are doing things, and it's sort of part of that mentoring. But there's so many great stories in every country around the world, so it can be done through awards. But to recognise people is the fourth thing that I think is really important. And the fifth thing is to have mechanisms to share, to mentor. It is part of a community, so we don't learn in isolation as individuals, but we need to ensure that we're sharing our ideas and learning from each other in our little global village in whatever part of the world we find ourselves in. So it's access, encouraging use, creating freedom, recognising people for their achievements, and sharing that mentoring. They're the 5 things.
I've spent some years with the ministers of education in Pakistan, and every time I meet them I hear we need more buildings, we need more universities, we need more infrastructure, physical buildings. Do you agree on that? Do you really think we need more buildings? I mean, in Pakistan, for example, we have 400,000 schools which are empty. Mm-hmm. Most of them don't have good teachers. Mm-hmm. Another problem is that the teacher quality is really bad. Mm-hmm. So they're trying to fix teacher education. Do you really think we'll need teachers in future, or do you think we need facilitators in future? Yeah. What do you think we need? What kind of infrastructure they should be focused on? As you already said, technology. But in countries like Pakistan, they're still focused on creating more buildings and more schools and more bricks and mortars, universities. We have 300 universities already. Do we need more?
Yeah, good question. Often it's the entrepreneurs that are quick to adapt to social and change within society. Governments and intergovernment bodies are often very slow to identify change and adapt to a different culture. And then one example, like the very first book that was published in English was in 1475. It took 300 years. It was 300 years later before books became textbooks in English schools. When change is going on, sometimes governments, it's just as easy just to do what the previous Minister of Education did, or the one before then, but let's not rock the boat. But clearly, it's evident around the world, buildings are a thing of the past. That phone in your hand, that computer on the table, that cord that plugs that phone and that computer into the World Wide Web is the building. And it's really about populating people with that new technology, allowing them to use it, because they can access the best universities in the world we don't need to build another one down the road. Through that little cord attached to that phone, links them to the best high schools, the best education, the best universities in the world. So empty buildings or poorly located buildings and more of them is simply not the answer. It is certainly adapting to these new technologies, and governments historically can be slow to firstly recognise change and then change course to adapt to that change. And I guess it's people like us that can be out there in the public space saying, hey, the world is changing, and finally, little bit by little bit, that message will get through.
There's a lot of influence of US aid and DFID and organizations like that in the third world countries and developing countries. They are still building or wanting to build bricks and mortars because that's the demand from the ministries. What do you suggest to them they should be doing instead of trying to build bricks and mortars? What should their role be? Because they're influencers. It's their money. It's the taxpayers' money from Australia, from the US, from UK, which money is being used to build infrastructure in the developing world. What should their character or role should be in the education space? It's a difficult question.
It is. With international donors, I guess the general way today is really to look to the countries where the money is going for them to provide plans how that money is spent. And sometimes in smaller and isolated countries, they're not aware of new technology that can radically change their educational space. So they will request from their foreign donors money to build new schools. But yeah, it's a tough one, and really I think the donors need to ensure that the money that is provided, and it is shrinking, is used well. And again, as the previous analogy, in government often it's difficult for them to change course the way that they do things. But again, it's simply as people like ourselves that in our association with key people of influence in the community and people within government, really to highlight how the world and how is changing and how the educational landscape is changing. And I think if those ministers of government would say to USAID, look, right at the moment we don't need more buildings, but we need this, and then I think that would be the starting place of change. And I think really to integrate a spirit of entrepreneurialism in some of those decisions, and when there's freedom to think outside the square, and there's many great people around the world, like the Bill Gateses of the world, that are keen to provide and share their wisdom if they're asked. And I know they have hearts for helping countries and individuals that are not as that are struggling. So let's, in this global village that we live in, let's turn to successful people outside of government who have been successful in other parts of business to be mentors, to be supporters, to share their ideas and allow that to influence some of the decisions that governments make.
Who are the 5 great people who should be reached out to by everyone, and their work should be studied if somebody is a teacher or an educator?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, good question. I mean,
who are your mentors? Who would you ask?
Yeah. Well, I because I am a social entrepreneur, I tend to go firstly to other sort of entrepreneurs and people like, as an example, Richard Branson, who didn't have a university qualification and established a multi-billion-dollar business. So people like that, the Bill Gateses of the world, the Mark Zuckerbergs of the world, people who have used new technology and are really changing the world that we live in quickly. Then I think like there's people that I would identify as of power and influence, people like Barack Obama as an example. Then you want to identify people with, if you like, a spiritual element and emotional intelligence, and sometimes it might be, you know, the work of Mahatma Gandhi or the work of various prophets or spiritual people, both in our past or alive today. But I think, you know, body, mind and soul, we just don't want to preclude the spiritual and the emotional side in this discussion, but be holistic in all aspects of our life.